Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session on police accountability and oversight. My name is Asad Kiani. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm in my office today at the university, and I want to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Today's event, Who Polices the Police, which examines policing accountability and oversight, is a second event in a series organized by myself, Avnish Nanda, and the BCCLA, in particular Latoya Farrell, on policing reform and accountability. I want to thank Avnish for bringing us together. To Latoya, I want to thank her for organizing us and pulling together all of our panelists and for managing us from behind the scenes today. And I want to thank the BCCLA for their institutional support. In a few moments, we're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn for about 15 minutes each. Once each of the panelists has made their opening remarks, we'll open up to questions from the audience, and we'd love to hear from you. So if you have a question you'd like to ask our panelists, you can submit it to us using the chat window in the YouTube page. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. If you can't stay for the whole session or you want to rewatch it down the road, a recording of the session will be posted right here on the YouTube channel for the BC Civil Liberties Association. We'll go through all of our panelists. We might have a bit of flexibility here, a bit of on-the-fly maneuvering. Our panelists today are Meghan McDermott, Tom Engel, and Nia Singh, and I'll introduce all of them before they speak. Nia is in a sentencing hearing right now, so he might jump in a little earlier than anticipated. And so we'll try and keep that flexibility available to account for Nia's demands with respect to his schedule. So let me introduce then our first panelist, who's Meghan McDermott. She's the interim policy director at the BC Civil Liberties Association. Before joining the BCCLA as a staff lawyer in 2017, Meghan worked as an advisor to the provincial government for many years, and she's now leading the BCCLA's work on police reform in the province.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here today to talk about this important issue. As Professor Kiani just said, I'm with the BC Civil Liberties Association. For those of you who don't know us, we've been around for over 50 years, almost 60 actually, and we were actually born out of outrage from a mass arrest. There were about 60 people, over 60 people arrested at once in the Kootenays by the Rcmp. There were allegations that they were a threat to the Canadian state and also the province of BC. A bunch of people got angry and upset about the violations of human rights, and thus was born the organization for which I work. We're one of the organizations in BC that does do advocacy and monitor issues related to police accountability. I'm going to try really hard to not overwhelm people with buzzwords. There's a lot of terminology associated with police accountability. There's a lot of bodies. You'll see this in the media that the police will refer to a number of different bodies of oversight. Just to throw some out there, we hear about police boards. We hear about Director of Police Services, coroner's inquests, commissions of inquiry, lawsuits, the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, a lot of acronyms for these. And depending on where you are in Canada as well, you will hear references to different acronyms. And this can really throw people off and also give us a sense of comfort that there is a lot of oversight. What I want to impress upon you today is that any kind of accountability measures that we have in Canada have only come after a lot of work, a lot of advocacy, usually after really, really big scandals where the public demands change. We end up with big volumes of books like this into things that go wrong with lots and lots of recommendations in them. These aren't necessarily ever followed through though. So what I get to do at my organization is pay attention to these systems, try to monitor them, ask for change, ask for gaps to be filled in, because our system is not as good as that which we deserve. Over and over again, every day, we're hearing about tragedies, abuses of power, and people suffering at the hands of police actions. So I'm going to try to shed some light on this today by providing a high-level overview of some of the bodies and review systems that we have. I wanted to take a few minutes actually to situate the current crisis in accountability and all the conversation and allegations about systemic racism and discrimination in policing. I just want to ground this in some history to say that this is not new. This has been going on for as long as the province of British Columbia at least has existed. There are records going back to our early colonial days when the Rcmp, which was then known as the Northwest Mounted Police, they were asked how things were going with settling this region of Canada. The reports that we have historically are filled with mentions that the Indians, and I'm using this term because that was the historic term and we also still have the Indian Act, but the Indians will not stay on reserve. Even though it's clear that British law allowed them to move everywhere, but apparently this was an issue for the police. And the police were enforcing a pass system that some of the First Nations communities knew wasn't legally enforceable, and the police were aware of this, and they would send dispatches back to Ottawa about this. The important part of this story for me and for us is that it shows that what we're up against is very deeply entrenched in our culture, in our society, and in our policing systems, in our governance models. It also shows two things. One is the structural racism that's embedded in some of our police forces, if not all of them. It also shows that there's a problem with the rule of law, that even back then, the police knew that they didn't have the legal authority for what they were doing, and they felt comfortable doing that. So there's a direct line between stories like this and things that we do now. For instance, BCCLA is involved, we've been involved for a few years now in a policy complaint against the Vancouver Police Department for how it stops people on the street arbitrarily outside of any kind of investigation, which is essentially harassment of people on the street. It's discriminatory. There's no legal authority for it if it's outside of an investigation. So we continue to see these discriminatory, arbitrary actions, and we continue to have a hard time holding our forces accountable for it. So we are out there and we're trying to do it. But again, there's just so many gaps in the system and it's simply not good enough and we deserve better. So accountability, what is it? A lot of people tend to think about accountability as what should happen when something goes wrong. That's kind of the traditional concept of it. But what I urge everybody to think about today is that police accountability, at least for us, is also proactively holding the police accountable. So not waiting for something to go wrong and then to figure out why and how could we prevent it in the future. But why don't we have practices that protect our communities? And that's what we demand, and that's what we try to do. And there are a lot of problems with even trying to do this. There's a massive asymmetry in terms of information. The police can have a lot of information about us, both individuals and collectively. And it's very, very difficult for us to discern information about the police, about them, if we think about it as them. So one way that this plays out is just public consultations. Do you ever see any? No, they're very few and far between, at least where I'm situated. Police budgets, I don't know how citizens really have a say in that. You're starting to see this issue come out now, and people are really struggling to figure out what are the budgets, how can we have a say, how can we get the budget lowered, what about when new weapons are brought onto the scene? Does the public, are we even aware about them? Did we know when tasers were purchased by our police agencies and then started to be used, or did we just start to inspect that retroactively when people started to be harmed by the use of tasers? So this I think it's really important to just track proactively what our police are doing. There are a few scenarios I can point to that really highlight that the police will withhold this information from us, which is just undemocratic and really difficult in terms of trusting the police and the relations between the police and the public. So one example of this, a really good one actually, was earlier this year. There was a conversation in the media about Clearview AI and facial recognition technology, and the media went and asked the Rcmp and also some municipal agencies if they were using this kind of software, and they denied it. And lo and behold, about a month or two later, they corrected their statement and said, oh, actually, we have been using this. Now they've stopped it. And now we're looking at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada having to look into it now after the fact. Whereas we should expect that police would do a privacy impact assessment before they even unleash this kind of surveillance technology on the public. But they don't do this. Same thing with stingrays. That's another type of surveillance technology. This is an issue with drones as well, how drones are being used. We would like to see police proactively let their communities know that they're using these kind of very invasive surveillance technologies on them, and that we'd like to see when they use them. Are they using them at peaceful protests, or are they using them only for car accident reconstruction type issues, as they always like to allege that they're using them for? So when we see secrets like this, obviously it erodes public trust in police. Another issue is that we often try to get the information from police if they're not proactively disclosing it. So an example here is there is a fellow in Edmonton that was trying to figure out even about school resource officers in the public school system in Edmonton. So he asked for just some stats on which which schools the police were in, and the aggregated statistics, disaggregated racial statistics about the types of students that were getting caught up in bait phone programs, where police would leave phones in a school and to bait people, and then got them caught up in the criminal justice system. Well, the police came back asking for $65,000 to find this out. And if you actually look into it, they wanted to charge this individual more than they were allowed by law. So this is a big problem when the police won't disclose things proactively and then are trying to charge us more than they're allowed to, even to get this basic information. I see that my time's actually running quite quickly, so I'm going to move just very quickly to the reactive responses that we have when things do go wrong here in BC. We're lucky, somewhat lucky, in that we do have an independent investigations office. It's intended to be a civilian-led agency. It's been around for 8 years now. If there are issues of serious harm or death involved with police, there's now a civilian oversight agency. I can speak more in our question and answer period about defects with that model, but I do say we're lucky to have it because we pushed for it for so long. It only came after major inquiries, particularly around the one with Robert Jacansky, who was killed by tasers, and there was a cover-up afterwards at the Vancouver airport in the early 2000s. Like I say, it's not as good as we deserve. For anything less than those pretty high thresholds of serious harm or death, then we rely on these two other agencies that can look into issues of misconduct. So this is if the police search you unlawfully on the street, if they were rude to you, or if they do anything to you and harm you, even psychologically, but anything less than that serious harm threshold. And these oversight bodies are not true oversight bodies. They basically, our government allows the police to investigate themselves. And then if the individual who complained is upset with how that investigation went, they can ask for a review by these bodies. These bodies do not have enough powers though, and they can only look at what happened after the fact. And I can also provide some illustrations later about how, even right now in 2020, these bodies aren't dispensing justice in the way that we deserve in Canada. So I look forward to the conversation. Thanks for listening to the BC perspective.
Thanks so much, Megan. That was really insightful and very helpful for us to give us some context. we're just waiting to see if Nia Singh is able to join us right now, and I think he is able to join us. And so we're lucky to have Nia. Nia will be able to join us for just a few minutes. He's on his break right now from the sentencing hearing I mentioned to you earlier. For those of you who don't know Nia Singh is a lawyer and activist who's been at the forefront of the anti-carding movement in Toronto for many years, and is currently representing the families of Regis Kortinsky-Paquette and Jamal Francique, who died in separate interactions with the police this year. Nia, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for allowing me to. I apologize to all our guests because I am in the middle of a sentencing. I had informed the panel earlier and I was hoping it would be done sooner, but it's not. So thank you again for allowing me to be here. The question is, who's policing the police? And I just want to say in my short time frame, I have about 5 minutes, that policing the police is a very intricate practice, and it takes a lot of calmness, it takes a lot of perseverance, and it takes a lot of courage. The forces that you're up against are compounded, they're governmentally funded, and generally people who police the police are community members without much funding. The unfortunate reality is a lot of injustice takes place with people from marginalized communities, and they do not have recourse when they do not have funds. So one of the main issues that I want to point out is in a few of the cases that I've dealt with, and for any of our participants, they can pay attention to the Fabian Clark case. That is from November 2018. That Toronto Star article was done on it. Fabian Clark with an E on the end. This man was raided in his home. He was beaten severely. He had no criminal record, 40 years old. And what ended up happening, and you know what I'll do is I'll just pull up a screenshot of the article for you, and I'll share my screen as I talk about it. I'm on a, so this is the case from Jim Rankin, and this is Mr. Clark. And the story is he's in his home, police come by, they think that he's a drug dealer, they have old intelligence, they come in and they barge into his home. They don't identify themselves as police officers. And what they end up doing is covering the peephole and entering the apartment. He's received so many punches to his face that the bottom of his eye was torn apart, which required reconstructive surgery. Because I do a lot of community work, a community worker then notified me of what had happened. And I had to contact the SIU myself and ask them, why has this not been part of the SIU case? They followed up with an investigation. They did one, but unfortunately, they concluded that because Mr. Clark stated he had 20 punches to his face, that his face would have been damaged more, and therefore they don't find the information reliable. And they said the police used appropriate force. I can tell you that there were 9 officers involved in this raid on the apartment. And when we got to trial finally, I only was able to get through 3 officers before the judge stopped the proceedings and asked the Crown, why are we going forward and to address the matter? And shortly after that, the Crown stayed the charges. The officer himself didn't even know that he was the one named in the complaint against my client. So what ended up happening is my client was charged with obstruct justice as he sat in a bed and was waiting for surgery, where the police officers came and threatened him that if he did not sign this paperwork, he would be taken into custody and he would lose the job that he actually lost. This is just one story out of many. The issue is anybody wishing to combat police violence or police the police must understand that it's a long process, that everything doesn't happen in one day or 1 month or even 1 year. When we first challenged the carding process, it was after the Jim Rankin article that exposed that there's a disproportionate amount of stops for people of African descent. And that took, and is still taking time to go through, but that took 4 years to get to a point where the Ontario government issued a regulation regulating the practice. main points to remember is in SIU investigations. I'm sure, I know in BC you have a similar body, but if you're representing a family, ensure that the family is very clear on what the process will be, on what they will provide as evidence. If you don't feel comfortable with providing evidence, do not provide it until you've vetted that evidence. There are many little takeaways from this, but I apologize. I do have to leave now and get back into court. But what I will do is come back on as soon as I'm done. If the conversation is still taking place, I'll contribute, and I'll do my best to send something to the organizers that I can send out to all the participants. And I apologize for having to leave, and I would have loved to answer questions, but I will dial back in as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Neil. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. We understand things change on the fly. We'll still be here for another hour or so. So if you're able to join us, that'd be wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And what I'll do is I'll send a link to a lot of the stories I was going to discuss.
Great, thanks. Our next panelist is Tom Engel, who's one of Alberta's most distinguished criminal defense lawyers. For many years, he's chaired the Criminal Trial Lawyers Association Policing Committee, and he's a recipient of numerous awards recognizing his contributions to human rights and civil liberties. Tom, thanks for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on what's happening in policing and policing reform.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it as well. All right, limited time here. It's a very big, complicated topic, so I'll try to convey as much essential information as I can in the time I have. I want to tell everybody who's listening and watching that there's something that inspired me early on in my career in this area, and that was a book that the Edmonton Police Commission Public Complaint Director gave to me, which he called the Bible for Civilian Oversight, and it was written by Samuel Walker. It's called Police Accountability, the Role of Citizen Oversight, published in 2001. I highly recommend it to anyone who is listening in here. So one part of this book stands out to me, and I wish I could quote it, but somebody borrowed it and didn't return it. But it goes like this: do not underestimate the effectiveness of one dedicated civil rights lawyer in one city. And that is so true. One person can make a big difference if you are persistent and dedicated. Okay, so civilian oversight in Alberta. There are two police services in Alberta. One category is municipal police services. They are governed by the Police Act. And the rest is the Rcmp. They're governed by the Rcmp Act. So let's talk about municipal police services like the Edmonton Police Service, Calgary Police Service. The first level of oversight is the police commission in each municipality. The commissioners are appointed by city council. They really have no significant power or effective power over misconduct allegations, even systemic ones. The CTLA says that has to change. We are in the middle of a complete overhaul of Alberta's Police Act, and the CTLA is one of the key participants in that process. And this is one of the things we're saying has to change. We say that police commissions, and this should apply across the country, should have the power to order the chief of police to do things regarding systemic issues, like, for example, carding, stop carding, develop a use of force policy that fits what the police commission thinks is right, train in systemic racism, and so on. Also, the police commission has a public complaints director who reviews all of the investigations and the complaints being investigated by the Edmonton Police Service, but all they can do is review it. They don't have any power to order the chief of police to take certain steps in the investigation. They should have that power. So I can tell you this, that in the review of the Police Act, every stakeholder, all police services, all police unions, all stakeholders agree that the investigation of complaints against police officers should be removed from police services and should be put in the hands of a provincial body. We have a provincial body called ASIRT, the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team, but everybody's saying, no, let's get out of the business of investigating complaints against ourselves. Police services, police chiefs know it doesn't look good, and so do police unions. So hopefully that will happen. And if you want to see examples of outright corruption in the process of police investigating themselves, you can find many of them, but you can look to the Calgary Police Service and something called the Ark Install Inquiry, which was a major public inquiry by the Law Enforcement Review Board. And then you can look at the documentary that is now in full movie context called No Visible Trauma. And that one in particular is an eye-opener about what can go wrong when the police are investigating themselves. Okay, so you have a complaint that's investigated by the police service. The chief makes a disposition. You don't like it, where do you go? Or the chief orders a disciplinary hearing. You don't like the outcome. You're the complainant. Where do you go? You go to the Law Enforcement Review Board. That is an independent panel, and the panel is composed of civilians. A lawyer is the chair, and there's a lawyer on each panel. This is a very effective civilian oversight body. The appointments have been good. I hope it continues under the UCP. Time will tell. They have the full power to overturn decisions of the chief, order disciplinary hearings, and overturn the outcomes of disciplinary hearings, and to impose discipline, including firing an officer. It's completely public. Citizens, anybody can attend. Their decisions are on CanLII, and the whole entirety of the record from the hearing below or from the decision below is once the hearing is held before the LERB, it becomes available to the public. There can be an appeal from a decision of the LERB to the Alberta Court of Appeal on a point of law. To me, this is a standard that should be followed in the rest of Canada. So then we have ASIRT, serious injury or death or matters of a serious or sensitive nature. Problem is they're overworked, understaffed, and from the outset of their investigation to a decision is normally about 3 years. Problem is, one big problem is that the investigative personnel are all present or former police officers. That is bad optics, and in some cases, actual bias I've seen. So I favor a mix of non-police investigators and investigators with police experience, but not serving police officers. You know, you could take a good criminal defense lawyer, experienced one, who has learned how to take apart an investigation, knows how investigations should take place, and that person could easily fit into the investigators or the investigative environment within ASIRT. The executive director of ASIRT is a former Crown prosecutor. We vehemently disagree on that. Then, once ASIRT decides whether there are reasonable grounds to believe that a criminal offense has taken place, this is referred to the Alberta Crown Prosecution Service. This is a major problem in Alberta because some of their decisions are just flat out perverse and have the appearance of bias. So I favor having an independent or semi-independent, but a segment of the Crown Prosecution Service that populated by experts in the area, senior crowns who have courage and dedication, who will not only make the decision whether to prosecute, but also to carry the prosecution. So now I'm going to turn to the RCMP. So the RCMP police is a large part of Alberta. And I'll just say this, what they do is they investigate themselves. It's even in small detachments, you have a sergeant in that detachment investigating a complaint against his or her fellow officers. That's obviously biased, not only appears to be biased, but is biased. And most of their investigations are simply they have no integrity and they're corrupt. Then what happened with the RCMP Act is Harper brought in I think it's called the Enhancing the Accountability of the RCMP Act, which is a laughable title because all it really did was provide a limitation of 1 year for making a complaint and narrowed the class of citizens who had standing to complain. It needs to be gutted and start over. The Civilian Review and Complaints Commission is toothless. If you don't like the decision made by the RCMP, you ask them to review it. They only have power to make recommendations to the commissioner. Their report goes to the commissioner. She sits on it for a year or more. And then if she disagrees, nothing can be done about it. So I think that what's happening here is that investigations by RCMP officers into the complaints are corrupt because they know that the CRCC can't do anything about it. So it also takes years to get a result. Their decisions, the CRCC decisions are not published as they are by the LARB. The officers involved, their names are kept secret. And actually, I think Alberta is talking about replacing the RCMP with an Alberta Police Service. This is a powerful reason to get rid of the RCMP in Alberta. So we have been advocating with Public Safety Minister Blair for a total reform of the RCMP Act. How am I doing for time?
You have about two and a half minutes left.
Okay. All right. Suing the police. First of all, do not plead your client guilty to any criminal offense or take a peace bond or anything like that if it could prejudice your client's claim, unless you absolutely have to. Many of those who sue the police wish that they had not. You need a lawyer, it's expensive. They're difficult to take on contingencies, percentage agreements, because the damages awards in Canada, especially Alberta, are pitiful. In Alberta, the government many years ago immunized the police from being sued in small claims court, which has a $50,000 limit. So in small claims court, a cop can sue you for punching him or her, but you can't sue the cop for punching or for being punched by the cop. That's obviously inequitable. The CTLA is trying to see what we can do about that, but we know we'd have to go to court to get anything changed. That probably is time's up, right?
I mean, you got a minute or so if you want to add anything else in there. We can move to questions now. You can.
All right, I got one more thing. Use of force policies and training. I don't put much stock in training. I think that any Canadian knows what excessive force is when they see it. And so do the cops. The problem is there's a lack of accountability when it happens. There are certain things that we see nowadays every day where most Canadians would say that cop should be immediately fired, or that cop should be suspended without pay immediately. And that cop and the cops who are standing around watching it and not doing anything about it, or who lie in their reports or don't mention in their reports what happened, they should be criminally prosecuted and they should be fired too. That's what creates accountability, not the policies. You need public denunciation and general and specific deterrence to effect changes, not more policies.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom. Really appreciate that. So we've got a lot of great ideas to start a conversation. We have a bunch of questions coming in as well. So I'm gonna throw this one out to the panelists, both Meghan and Tom. Both in BC and Alberta right now, there has been or is an ongoing review of police oversight legislation and accountability mechanisms. So perhaps you can answer this question that comes from the chat. What's the best way to apply political pressure to give the civilian-led police oversight agencies power and motivation to enforce policing standards? So what do we have to do to make this happen in terms of political pressure? And maybe as part of that, you can talk about the sort of the political dynamics and that are happening right now, both in Alberta and BC.
Me first?
Sure, Tom, yeah.
Okay, well, I learned a long time ago, I've been doing this for over 20 years, learned a long time ago that as lawyers, we have a duty to educate the public. And by educating the public about these things and bringing them to public attention, you will get, and if you're constructive in terms of what you're proposing should be changed, and if you show that you are interested in improving policing and providing positive contributions to government and police services, you will get the public on your side. You have to have the public on your side in order to get the politicians to do something. The politicians by nature are very wary of taking steps that might provide more governance or oversight of the police. Because they just don't think it's politically popular. So you have to get the public on your side. If you get them on your side, the politicians will follow.
Megan?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's something that BCCLA tries to think about every day, is how to kind of create that political space so that our elected officials have no choice but to act in our interests. So what I would think, definitely stay engaged in the issues. I'm always so grateful when the media uncovers these issues. Of course, we have a crisis in journalism happening too in Canada, but the more that we stay aware, the better. It shows just collectively that the public is engaged. This conversation that's come out of the numerous tragedies in the United States is quite momentous, I think, right now. We kind of have the wind at our back, and I hope that we can capitalize on this momentum and not let it get away. So in the BC case, our government had called for, they had summoned a special legislative committee, an all-party one. We have 3 parties here, and they were going to look into the Police Act. They had their mandate was very broad in scope. It was almost everything except decriminalization. So it was specifically looking at wellness checks, which is such a nefarious issue with policing and accountability of police. So unfortunately, there was an election called, which kind of put an end to that committee. It was supposed to go forward for basically kind of like an academic year, and we were expecting to make multiple submissions to them. And we were very interested in what others would say. Of course, our province has re-elected the same government that had called for that committee. So we have yet to see if that committee will be reconstituted. We've already seen the Police Services Division of the Solicitor General. They've now kind of made a special project. I think it's called something about like modernizing police. So what that tells me is that there will be some internal work about police reform, but it might not be as big as we had expected. I think it's really important that we call upon our government to do something as big as they were going to do. We've also seen signals in the throne speech in Ottawa that there's going to be a number of studies. Now, of course, we should be skeptical of studies. I've got these recommendations next to me. But I think the importance of it now to have our elected officials look into it is that a lot more voices that have never been listened to are starting to be listened to. And those voices need to be talking to our decision makers. We would be very interested in all these processes to make them as open as possible for everybody. So we will definitely be advocating for lots of direct public consultation. Something that we see over and over again in these conversations is that the public entities that are trying to build trust, they'll come to an association like ours. Of course, I'm happy to work with them, but we're just a small group of lawyers and with a narrow focus in one part of the province, and we don't see these people go to the public at large. There's rarely a mechanism. I'm thinking of one. There was in the wake of the awful investigations in Toronto, or lack of investigations with the MacArthur killings. There's been quite an open and broad process allowing for anonymous submissions, but usually we don't see something like this where there is open for public input. Definitely, people are interested. Anybody that's into this stuff, follow us on social media. Tom Engel, great. Nia Singh, you, Professor Kiani, all of us follow BC Civil Liberties Association. Today, we dropped a lawsuit against the commissioner of the Rcmp. So we're constantly updating and trying to keep the public engaged with what's happening in this very complicated field. And we make calls to action quite a lot. Just stay engaged, write to everybody, demand more, talk to everybody you know, protest.
So maybe I can just follow up on this conversation about political engagement. Is it fair to say that there's something undemocratic about police oversight and accountability mechanisms as they exist now? Megan, you mentioned undemocratic practices in your opening remarks. Maybe I can start with you on this. Is oversight undemocratic, or has it been sort of an abdication of democratic responsibility somewhere here?
Yeah, I'd be willing to say so, definitely. Like, I see a massive failure is that our government hasn't provided the accountability mechanisms that we deserve. And for somebody like me who looks at these and how we, the kind of watchdogs that we have over many facets of our society, one big thing is independence, and it's independence to the legislature. We don't have that. We have an office of the Police Complaints Commissioner here in BC. Its statutory powers aren't as broad as they should be, but at least they report to the legislature. So that prevents political interference. Whenever you see somebody reporting directly to a minister, it's very easy for them to, if they make findings that are problematic, for certain powerful people or the government of the day, then they'll get their budget cuts. They can't hire enough investigators, and you'll just kind of see the whole body go sideways. So we need true independence, really. Another thing I can speak to is the police boards. So police boards are these things that we have on the local level. So not where the Rcmp exists, so where we have municipal services. And the idea is that they're a level of oversight in real time. So a big thing they do is they hire the chief of police. That's really one of their big political powers. A lot of the other things, of course, kind of the day-to-day operations, we're finding some of them at least are a bit out to lunch on, but those boards themselves can be quite politicized. In BC, at least, only one of so the mayor sits on the board, but the mayor really can't vote for the most part unless there's a tie. But the local government can appoint one person to the board, but all the other appointees are provincial. And for the most part, I encourage people to go look at who's on your local police board, and if you even know who they are. And a lot of them just have connections to the governing political party. They don't necessarily have any expertise, or they don't reflect the community either. And a big thing that I think a lot of people will be very aggrieved to find out about is that when the police are sued, at least here in BC, for wrongdoing, and if they do actually have to pay out, it's actually the city that's on the hook for this. So here we have our province appointing, they basically get the say to who's on the police board. The police board's supposed to be overseeing the police really screw up, they kill somebody. And then who pays out for it? Well, it's the citizens of the local municipality. So that's like a glaring example of just democracy that's not, it's undemocratic, lack of democracy, really.
Thanks, Megan. Tom, do you have any thoughts on this idea about democracy in action or not in action in police oversight?
Yeah, okay, well, like I said, for municipal police services, the police commission is appointed by city council. So that's an elected body. And the city council puts 2 councillors on the police commission. So I would say that's fairly democratic, and their meetings are open. They have public meetings. So I don't have a big problem with that, although I am advocating in the Police Act reform that to consider, there are pros and cons to consider having all commissioners on the police commission elected at the same time city council is elected. That would make it more democratic, might be less representative, I don't know. But then we go to the appointments to the Law Enforcement Review Board. They are appointed by the Solicitor General. I would like to see them appointed by an all-party committee or something like that, because I worry about the particular, sometimes the Solicitor General is a former police officer, and that's not ideal. But it's worked pretty well, but I have my fingers crossed with the UCP that that will continue. But let's turn to the RCMP. I mean, there's nothing democratic about their oversight. There's nothing civilian about their oversight, except for the CRCC, which I have mentioned is toothless. I don't even know who appoints the commissioner or whatever, the CRCC. It's probably the minister of public safety. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. It's toothless. It doesn't matter. Although, you know, she's trying to do her best. I'll give her that. But you know what? It's interesting that Meghan talked about this is how the police boards in BC, that would be the police commissions here in Alberta, appoint the chief of police. Think about the RCMP. What choice does the community that's going to be policed by the local RCMP detachment have in the appointment of a commanding officer for that detachment? The answer is zero, nothing. And they stay there for maybe 3 years and then they're gone. They don't have to build any connections with the community. I've been advocating in the Police Act review that they should have direct input and choice of who the commanding officer will be in that local detachment. A lot of these communities are Indigenous, and they get some white guy who comes in who's might be from, I don't know, Ontario or Quebec or whatever. That's just not right, and that is not democracy in action. Because when you think about it, I know one of the topics is where does police power come from? Well, it comes from the people. The people grant the police their power, and the statute is what governs it. So the police, the people have to be empowered in key decisions like that. Who's going to be the RCMP detachment commander?
Great. Thanks so much. Building off that and suggestions for possible reforms here, are there other jurisdictions or countries that may give us a model for positive or effective police accountability? Can you think of any other places where we might model our systems of oversight on? I'll start with Tom.
Okay, well, that's a good question. But I do know in reading a lot of American books, like the books by Samuel Walker, which I highly recommend, and there are many textbooks written by experts in the area. They talk about, Sam Walker in that book I mentioned before, Police Accountability, talks about the different models. And there are, you know what, in a lot of ways, the American system of police oversight is admirable, because you've seen in some cities, the mayor sees a video of excessive force and the mayor fires the cop. That's radical in Canada, and we should be looking at something like that. Or the chief just fires the cop. Here, it takes years to fire a cop, and then they'll retire on the eve of the disciplinary hearing, having been on paid vacation for 3 years or something like that. The federal government comes into a city like, I can't remember, Columbus or Cleveland or something, and does an in-depth investigation about their police service, and then comes out with recommendations, basically marching orders for that police service that they have to comply with. So I think we're way behind in Canada. There are some really good models in the United States that we could copy. As for other jurisdictions around the world, sorry, I don't know.
Megan, any thoughts on other jurisdictions?
Yes, I do. There is a model, apparently it's the gold standard internationally, according to some academics, I suppose, in the literature. And when I found out about it, I was like, oh, okay, kind of course. So Northern Ireland, where one can imagine there's been a lot of issues and sectarian violence, and issues of who ultimately the police report to, and it should be the public. So in Northern Ireland, they have something called the police ombudsperson. I think it was just incorporated or established in this millennia, so since 2000. I think what's great about the model is that it has jurisdiction to look into absolutely all criminal allegations against police. So something I'm sure listeners are aware of in listening to us is that there's all these different oversight bodies, right? Like if the police treats you like crap on the street or hurts you or arrests you for no reason, do you go to your local police board? Do you go to, what body do you go to? It's unnecessarily complicated. So what's great about this is they have jurisdiction over everything. It's easy for the public to navigate, and there's no internal investigations going on at all. It's all done by this ombudsperson body, and the body, like I kind of referred to earlier, reports to the legislature. So no matter what their findings are, they can't get their budget curtailed or anything, and the reports are made publicly available. However, when I do look at this body too, I don't think it's perfect. When I was reading about it, they do have a lot of ex-police officers involved, and that's an issue that we've come across. I would say everybody in the world kind of deals with this tension, is who can investigate the police, because at least the societies that I'm aware of, the only people that we really train up to do like blood splatter analysis, any kind of those like technical expertise, it's usually to go into the police services. And that's something that we've had issues with here in BC. Actually, like last year, it's kind of sad, but they actually had to change the law. They only did it on a 2-year basis, but the law here for that independent investigation office, so these are the civilian investigators who look into serious injury and death caused by police. They had a rule that they couldn't hire anybody to be an investigator if they had been a police officer within the past 5 years in BC. And they've now, they took away the application of that rule for 2 years because there's just an issue with finding qualified investigators who haven't recently been police. Now, fortunately, our IIO has actually been developing a training and certification course, but I think that's something that we need. I think it's something that we need from our educational institutions to have a different stream where people are trained to police the police, because it's something you rub up against. When you propose this model, the police want to say, well, I don't trust them. They don't know, like their findings are not credible because only we know how to do this. And it's kind of like a vicious circle. So we really need to, if we really want true civilian oversight, we need to really think about and invest in models where civilians can do a great, legitimate job of recommending charges against police officers.
Thanks. That's really helpful to think about this idea of having different institutions provide training to different people. That leads me into a question that's sort of interest to me, and maybe Tom, I'll ask you this, and Megan, you can also, of course, jump in. I work in a law school. I teach first year criminal law. I try and emphasize in my work and in the sort of the teachings that we give to these students, things about police powers and accountability. But what role should law schools play in ensuring or supporting police oversight and accountability?
That sounds like a real softball pitch to me. I mean, obviously, it's a very important part of the law, and nowadays, you know, with the focus that's being brought onto this, I think that I think it should be a required course, you know, that every student gets some kind of education in policing law, which would cover oversight mechanisms. And it's a complicated area, so I think probably a half-year course would be very good. I don't see it being made mandatory, but maybe it could be. But it could be an option. I know that at the University of Alberta Law School, two former prosecutors, actually present prosecutors, who are friends of mine. Yes, I do have friends who are prosecutors. Teach a course in police law. And Susan Hewson, the executive director of ACERT, and I attend yearly, and we present for over about 3 hours. We teach one of the sessions. So I think it's very important. I don't know how common that is in law schools, but I would certainly recommend it, just as I would make a pitch to recommend prison law being a dedicated course in law schools.
And Megan, if you have any thoughts here, welcome to hear them. Otherwise, we have lots more questions.
Yeah, I just agree wholeheartedly with Tom. So I say go on to another question.
Sure. So we've talked about, you know, the various different mechanisms in Alberta and BC and a little bit in Ontario as well. There's one thing that sort of was mentioned and we didn't really engage in fully. Perhaps both of you can talk a bit about how police disciplinary tribunals operate and how they might be improved as accountability mechanisms. And Megan, I can start with you on this.
Actually, I'm not really going to be able to speak to the ins and outs of them here. I just don't have that level of familiarity with them. But what I do want to say, though, is about the disciplinary record and, again, transparency. What's awful is that we don't know about the records. They're very, very well protected. If police officers do get disciplined, and that's part of this conversation too, especially when we think about the Rcmp and how oftentimes we see officers just transferred out of the community, but then they're brought into a new one to create a whole bunch of harm, right? And that community doesn't even know what the allegations were or any of the findings were against that officer who's now sent to them. Interestingly, it's one of the things that that President Trump pitched, right, was to have some kind of registry of disciplinary records of the police. It's incredible, I think, that this isn't transparent and that we don't have more insight into the records, and that we'd have to, you know, sue the police and hire a lawyer in order to get that kind of disclosure that I think should be something that should be transparent. I know I am a lawyer, and you can go to my law society's website and you can type my name in, and there will be very open, transparent records about any allegations against me in my past and what findings were made against me and what discipline I faced as a result. So if we want to protect the public from corrupt lawyers and negligent lawyers, I don't see why we wouldn't have a similar transparent system for our police.
Yeah, and lawyers don't carry guns around either. So anyway, here's the problem with police disciplinary panels in Alberta. municipal. Most of the presiding officers, they call them, are cops, either present cops or former cops. I just read a decision the other day where this presiding officer was talking about the real world of policing, and what was being urged by the prosecution doesn't really that prosecutor doesn't really understand the dynamics of being a police officer and this sort of thing, right? So one of the things that we're looking in the Police Act review at is just say no more present or former cops being disciplinary presiding officers. You can use lawyers, you can use retired judges, but not them. Okay, transparency on disciplinary decisions, disciplinary matters. Certainly agree with you, Megan, on that. That's one of the reasons why the Criminal Trial Lawyers Association 20 years ago or more established what I would colloquially call our bad cop database. And this is a database that is actually maintained in my office. And whenever we hear of misconduct by an officer, we open a folder and we put that information in there. And because, you know, if you look at the McNeil decision about requiring police services to disclose to the Crown matters of more than non-serious misconduct, well, then you have to rely on the police for what's not serious. And I don't trust them. And there's reason for that. So what will happen is members of the CTLA and even the media will come to me and say, hey, Tom, you got anything on this cop? And I will give them what I have. And also we have this phenomenon where by the police service regulation, serious offenses are expunged from a police officer's record after 5 years just by the passage of time. That doesn't happen with lawyers. You carry that record for the rest of your career. And so we have that on our bad cop database. So what will happen is the Crown, oddly enough, won't know about it because it got expunged. And then they show up at trial, and here I am cross-examining this cop on some terrible misconduct, and the Crown is completely ambushed by it, which works out okay sometimes, right? Or sometimes you might disclose it to the Crown, and the Crown might say, okay, that's it. But the Rcmp are particularly horrible at this. And at least under the Police Act, municipal services, their hearings have to be in public. And they have to publish them, and you can obtain them by FOI. But with the Rcmp, man, there has to be a complete reform there. I've run trials before. Well, I'll ask a cop, hey, do you happen to have any disciplinary history? Then you find out that the cop does, and the Rcmp hasn't told the Crown about it. So it's a real big problem, and I have to agree with President Trump on that one.
That's a sign that it's 2020 when we're agreeing with President Trump on these kinds of issues. It tells us something. It also tells us something about the debate and the extent of the issues that arise here. There's a couple of specific things I want to talk about or ask your opinions about before we jump back into some more big picture things. One of those is about the role of police unions or police contracts in police accountability and police reform. And so there's a lot of talk about how police unions are an obstacle to reform. What do you guys make of that position? Tom, yeah, sure.
All right, well, I've built a good, I went out of my way to build a good relationship with the presidents of the Edmonton Police Association, the union. Some presidents I didn't see eye to eye with, but there's a couple in particular who, when you sit down and talk with them, you can find that you'll agree on a lot of things. But they are politicians. They have to get elected by their membership. And so they can, and they get directed by a board of directors who are also elected. And it's a big impediment to a chief of police who wants to reform. You know, they have to, it's a balancing act. You know, they don't want to alienate the union. They don't want to go to war with the union. So they try to convince the union. The CTLA, we try to do the same thing to work with the union presidents. But you know, and I think it's borne fruit too, because I tried the same thing with the Calgary Police Association president, one of them in the past. And I think that we've seen a change of heart in regard to unions in Alberta about the need for reform. Now, of the Police Act in line with what we're advocating. Now, the Rcmp, they have a brand new union. They don't even have a collective bargaining agreement. So they're in its infancy. I view the fact that they're unionized to be a good thing. But in Alberta, I think I know what you're talking about, like having it built into contracts about when an officer can be fired and that sort of thing. Well, that's not the case in Alberta. It's the Police Act that governs, so we don't have to worry about that in Alberta.
Megan, any thoughts here or?
No, actually, it's something that I haven't really done that much research on, except that I think of them as having a lot of a strong political force. And I wonder about that when I look at police boards and whether or not they have the capacity to counteract whatever politicization or, you know, it allows police to be more political, and they do have a seat at a lot of the tables here, and probably across Canada, that when new standards are being made, there's a lot of deference given to the associations looking after the labor rights of police.
Right, so associations end up being a very important stakeholder in these discussions, but as you've pointed out, the public is often not a part of, or not a significant part of these discussions. That's maybe part of the problem here.
Right.
So one thing that I wanted to talk about that has been really a point of contestation for the last number of years, and it's come back up again in the last year or so, is the idea of body cameras. In British Columbia alone, at least I think 9 coroner's inquests into deaths at the hands of police have recommended the use of body cameras for both preventive and investigative purposes. What accountability problems can body cameras solve? And what problems do they potentially create? Megan?
Yeah, they're seen as a kind of a Band-Aid solution. And we actually the BCCLA were quite resistant to using body cameras. It's an interesting position because we do know that at least civilian cameras have brought a lot of light onto police practices, and that kind of the role of little brother, where we can film things, and we continue to see police try to illegally seize that kind of evidence because it's powerful to have a video narrative of something. But one thing, well, quite a few things that we're concerned about with it. One, it's very expensive to invest in that kind of technology. And like I say, it's a bit of a Band-Aid solution. Why don't we have police officers that we trust and that we don't need to record, rather than invest in this very expensive technology, which, by the way, is made by the company that brought us the great gift of tasers. So it's Taser International, which is now profiting off this accountability crisis. And that now there are calls for body-worn cameras. There are issues with control over the cameras, whether or not police can turn them on or off, and who ultimately has access to the recordings. Whether or not it would be a third party, how the recordings might be used, how they could be used against the very people that we think that they might be trying to protect. There are obviously concerns around privacy and privacy invasions, both for officers, but really for the public at large. If they were to capture something on a camera that they didn't see at the time and then go back and lay charges, it could result in more charges, more criminalization of certain communities. So we're apprehensive about it, quite resistant. We'd rather see police officers have less powers or have their powers kept in check, rather than make this kind of public investment into body-worn cameras.
Okay, well, subject to the privacy concerns, and I don't think there's that much of a problem with privacy concerns, because if they would presumably be only be available in relation to public complaints against police officers and criminal prosecutions, and if somebody did a FOI request for body cam recording, it could be denied because of a unreasonable invasion of privacy. You could pixelate faces out of it. So I know it's really expensive. I'm not sure it's worth the expense, but if it wasn't for the expense, I would say, yeah, we should use them. A bigger issue here in Alberta, in Edmonton in particular, is the fact that the police vehicles are not equipped with VICs, also known as ICDVS, which is what the Rcmp have had in their vehicles for many, many years, and is excellent equipment. I don't know if you know this, but the officer wears a microphone on his or her uniform. And when they go into a building, they can be 100 feet away, or maybe meters or something, but inside the building, and the audio will record, by radio signal. And the camera can switch around and look at the prisoner in the back seat. And so you always have audio. Maybe the camera is not capturing what's happening with the citizen, but the audio will. And they've been invaluable. And I think that if the citizen knows that they're being recorded and the officer knows that they're being recorded, maybe they'll behave better. Of course, I'll have to take that back right away, because we've seen in Thompson, Manitoba, and then in Calgary, we see situations in the cell blocks where the cop knows it's CCTV recorded, and they just brazenly beat the hell out of somebody. It's unbelievable. But so I would say that this technology in police vehicles is a lot cheaper than the body cams, and I would say do that first. I would also say that let's talk about police detachments. A lot of people get abused in police detachments. People die in police detachments. They all have CCTV recording, but they don't have audio. And so I heard an expert from Ontario, a use of force expert on I think CBC last night, talking about what happened to that woman who was knocked cold and dragged into the cell. And he said, well, I only have the video. Of course, he expressed an opinion it was excessive force, but I don't know what was said just before that. Well, why don't they have audio in the cell block? The Lacombe Police Department has audio in their cell block. So far as I know, that's the only police service in Alberta that has audio in the cell block. This is not rocket science. This is not really expensive. They should be required to have audio in their cell blocks. So many abuses of people by the police takes place in the detachments.
One more question here then, about specific things that could be done. Is there something that can be done to make it easier for prosecutors to lay charges against police officers without fear of damaging their relationship with other officers? I think, Tom, you mentioned the idea of having, and correct me if I'm wrong, about having dedicated prosecutors or independent prosecutors. Could you expand on that maybe, please?
Well, sure. I mean, there's always the problem that police officers are treated by the Crown, and the Crown treats police officers almost. I've heard Crowns say to them, by slip, my client, or if a deal is being proposed by me, I have to go check it with the officers. Who gives a crap about what the officers think. You're a I say this, you're a Crown prosecutor. They're not your client. You do what's right. If you think it's a proper settlement, do it. But they do, they go, I have to sell it to the officers, right? And so they're brothers or sisters in arms in law enforcement, in the law enforcement community. That's just the way it is. That's the dynamic. So you have to overcome it. So that's why you need to find prosecutors who are courageous and who are expert in the area, who don't care about what the police say. And it's going to have to be a Crown prosecutor. So just assemble a team of Crown prosecutors. It wouldn't have to be a dedicated team. That's all they do is prosecute cops. But, you know, they are a team. They get together from time to time. They talk about matters, and they are the go-to people to determine whether there's a reasonable likelihood of conviction. And if they make that determination to prosecute, they have carriage of the prosecution. One of the problems is the prosecution is assigned to a more junior prosecutor, and then, you know, they feel the heat in the courtroom, and then they bail. They pull the chute on the prosecution, and they shouldn't. And if you look at that documentary, No Visible Trauma, about the Calgary Police Service, you'll see that covered in that case.
Meghan, anything you wanted to add to this? So one question that's been posed in the chat is, what are some of the primary arguments provided by those who oppose police reform in Canada? And how do you respond to those sort of basic arguments against reform? Meghan?
I can't really think about an argument against police reform. Can you think of any that you can throw at me, and I'll try to tackle it?
So for example, police would say, you know, if there's enhanced accountability, then we are targeted and we can't do our jobs properly, or an argument like that. The idea of enhanced accountability makes it harder for them to do their jobs.
Oh, Tom wants to go.
I know one.
Yeah.
They'll on their own, they'll depolice. So in other words, they claim that they'll be driving by a scene maybe in the inner city of Edmonton. They'll see something going on and they'll just drive by. They don't want to get involved lest they be accused of being racist or something like that. They're, you know, well, if you've got cops like that, then fire them. You know, I mean, like, what are they doing? They're cops, right? That's their job. If they're not going to do it, fire them. Because it'll come to the attention of the chief sooner or later. On the business of, you know, they're afraid to use enough force. Well, I've never seen a problem there. Haven't heard of any situation described where, you know, this police officer should have used more force. No, never seen that happen. So an argument like that is just bunk. The argument that you know, well, let's talk about defunding. I mean, there you get arguments that actually have some reasonable basis. You know, there's a reasonable discussion about defunding. I don't like that. I don't like that particular term. I prefer like reallocation of resources, but it doesn't roll off the tongue that well, right? You know, I think that the defunding movement is a good one because it's causing everybody to critically analyze. You know, like Don Iveson, the mayor of Edmonton, and city council were stunned when they found out that they just laid out $500,000 for a new armored vehicle. And he said, you know, we're going to have to start going through this budget line by line. And then the two city councilors who were on the Edmonton Police Commission, which approved the purchase, they didn't even remember it, you know, and I'm thinking, well, Are you kidding me? Like, you have to, from now on, you're going to go through the budget line by line and catch a $500,000 purchase? What were you doing before? This is what they were doing before. First of all, the police service hid that expenditure, didn't call it an armored vehicle, called it police vehicles. So they were not being transparent with the commission or city council. Secondly, it was just an attitude. Well, if the police think they need it, let's go for it. So that's a really good. It's really good that this has produced, the movement that people who pay the money are going to start being very critical about this. Tactical teams, canine units, all these things. I don't think that, you guys hear my phone going off? Okay, sorry about that. So that's a good thing, but I mean, that's the only area where I see any kind of valid debate about police reform.
Yeah, I've been reflecting a little bit, and I'm thinking a bit about our fight that we're having here, which is ridiculous, about street checks. And there's resistance to this. And similarly with the police narrative about the use of the facial recognition AI. What I do is I carefully examine the arguments against it. So what they do is they tell us, they'll say something like, and they like to trot out child protection a lot and child predators. That's something that the public, I guess, just really gives into. You think about the absolute most vulnerable in the society and you say, we're trying to help them. But then you look at what else they're saying. So they may be putting that at the forefront, and it might even be disingenuous. So in the case of, say, arbitrary police stops or carding or street checks, depending on where you are, this is just when the police stop and start asking you about what you're up to. They might record your name, ask you for ID, or they'll just talk to you, even though you're not doing anything that's suspicious or they're not investigating any kind of crime. And there was a review put into this by the Vancouver Police Board. And when you look actually at the review, of course, the report is hundreds of pages. So who's going to spend the time to look through it? But if you actually look through it, you see that all their arguments crumble when you really inspect at what's actually going on. So what I try to do on the one hand is to kind of call their BS. Usually you can kind of pick up on it. Or else I invite people to come to civil society watchdogs like myself too, and we can help you pick up on what you're smelling and why it's foul and why it doesn't make any sense. It might be disingenuous. But another thing really is that you want the public on your side. The idea with where police powers come from and what they're supposed to be doing, it's fundamental to a relationship of trust. So usually in a lot of my advocacy, I try to think, if you want to enforce the law and keep people safe, those people you want to keep safe need to buy into what you're doing. So if there's resistance to reform, but reform is being called for by the very community that you're protecting, it's hard for them to make that argument if they're not hearing the voices of the people that they're supposed to be serving. So just really keep on about that. We all have our interests are aligned, right? It doesn't have to be adversarial. It often is, but it shouldn't be. We all have similar interests, and I try to keep those mutual objectives at the forefront when I attack.
Those are some really interesting points there. Tom, your point about the armored police vehicle in Edmonton really struck me when I heard about that earlier in the fall, because this goes back to the idea of democratic oversight and where is it? Considering especially that the police budget in most cities is the single biggest line item. The fact that they're only now, having this detailed oversight of $400 million they spend in Edmonton is stunning. And Megan, your point about looking into the arguments that are made quite closely, there's often this claim of effectiveness, right? We need street checks, we need facial recognition, and no sort of definition of what effectiveness means, or even evidence to back up those claims. So I think we're hitting on some really important issues here. We're almost out of time. And so this one last question for both of you, maybe more about who you are and how we can encourage more of this kind of discussion and public engagement. And this comes again from the chat. Is critiquing policing policy in Canada a dangerous or politically fraught act in 2020? And if so, how can we provide space to openly discuss the issue? Meghan, if you want to talk about that, and then Tom, I'll loop you in.
I think a lot of it depends on our identities and where we are. It's something I ask myself a lot. Even I have this big window behind me, and I like to put up, I like to express myself, and I like to put up signs. I've had some signs up that are critical of police or asking for accountability, and I do think twice about it. I think twice about, you know, if I had to call for help, or would I be protected, or would that maybe bias the police, prejudice them against me? I think, to be honest, I've got a level of protection and privilege because I'm a white woman. I'm also a lawyer. I'm very, very much aware that doing this work in other parts of space and time can put people at risk. I've been grateful so far. There have been no threats to my employer or to my colleagues who do this important work. But I would not be surprised. Like I say, I'm kind of constantly evaluating it, and I'm just grateful that the environment we're in right now, and my identity and my space in my community, I think allows me to do this and to speak forcefully without fear of revenge or of lack of protection. But again, I can't speak to everybody's experience.
Well, I don't want to miss this. I talked about how we organized a policing committee with the CTLA about 20 years ago. I would suggest to every lawyer listening, organize. There's strength in numbers. Organize your own bad cop database. So far as I know, we have the only database in Canada, the CTLA, on policing. I'm a member of the Criminal Lawyers Association Ontario, just joined, and I'm on their listserv. And I see them asking, people asking, anybody know anything about this cop? And they're waiting for people to reply. Well, Ontario doesn't have a database. They should have a database. Every organization, criminal lawyer organization, should have a database. And I'd be happy to explain how it works. It's not very complicated. Early in my work, probably for the first decade, I attracted lots of law society complaints by the cops, union making complaints. It was pushing 40 of them at one point. They lost out on every one. You can go and check my profile on the or my disciplinary history on the Law Society of Alberta website. There's one that went to a hearing because I said something bad about a cop and was reported to the media, but it was dismissed because the panel found I had a reasonable basis for it. So you have to be able, especially if you're starting out in a community where it's what you're doing is different. You have to expect that. I don't know if is likely to happen now. I don't think so, but you have to expect it. Just ride with it. That's part of our job. And but as time went on, and I made friends with police officers. I made friends with, I became familiar with cops who were in a position of power within the police service. And once they saw, once they realized that all we were trying to do was to make the Edmonton Police Service a better police service. And I was labeled as a cop hater too, and that I wasn't a cop hater. I still get that from time to time. I'm not a cop hater. I don't like bad cops, but I like good cops. And once you establish that track record with government, with the police services, with the unions, then you won't have any problems like that. And you should have no fear in doing that kind of work. But again, organize, because I have the CTLA, which has a membership of probably over 150 lawyers standing behind me, and they have defended me in law society complaints. So do something like that. Megan, you got the BCCLA to stand behind you. But you can create your own organization if you're not a member of one already.
Well, it's 1:30 and we're just about out of time then. I want to thank Meghan McDermott and Tom Engel for taking time out of their very busy schedules to join us. I want to thank Nia Singh for taking time out of his very busy schedule to join us briefly. Sorry we couldn't have him back for more, to answer more of your questions. I want to thank you for your presentations and answering our questions. I want to thank all of you for attending and joining us, and the BCCLA for helping us put this event on, and especially Abdirahman and Latoya Farrell for really bringing us together and driving all of this logistically. Thanks very much to everyone. The recording for this will be up shortly on this very YouTube channel, and look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you in the future. Thanks so much.